Welcome to Reimagining Cyber. This is Stan. I'm also here with Rob. And before we get into speaking to our great guest today, Rob, we had that episode last week on the SEC cyber rule going into
Yes.
effect in December.
Right.
And we saw some action, didn't we, from the SEC this week?
Yeah, this past week we did. Basically, right on the heels of us releasing that episode, the news came out that the investigation that the SEC was conducting on SolarWinds and some of their senior staff came out with actually charges against their CISO. So really shaking up the industry as it relates to the role of the CISO and some concerns, obviously serious concerns wrapped around that role and the impacts that something like this could potentially lead to.
Well, anyway, Rob, on to today's guest, who is Timothy Rohrbaugh, and he's the former CISO of JetBlue. And Tim has been in the cybersecurity field for over 20 years, and he's worked on both the private and public sector side of the equation. It's great to have you with us today, Tim. I've noted in some of your other presentations that you like to set the stage as to how we got to where we are today with cybersecurity by giving some of the history, and you cite the Rainbow series. And so just to let you know that I got my start at the National Security Agency as an Orange Book evaluator at the National Computer Security Center. And I contributed to some of those Orange Books on the Rainbow series
Yeah,
guidance books over the years. But you got your start in ComSec, right? In communication security.
I did. I did.
Anything else you'd like to add about your
Well,
background?
yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that you couldn't predict back then, right? I was an avionics tech for in the Navy, first sub hunting, then Russia went bankrupt, and then switched to F-14, F-18s, and then found myself working at CSC. And yeah, talking about the Rainbow series, one of the people working with me was Candace Stark. She was Commander Stark, and she wrote two of the books. So I had, had a lot of good people around me who really brought me into it just as it was all beginning. And then obviously worked at DISA. Many of us came out of DoD complex at that time.
Right, right.
Hey, so Tim, one of the things that we wanted to really start kind of the conversation with you on goes back to an interesting presentation you did earlier this year at RSA, right? And in the topic and kind of perspective you had, if I recall, was called the rate of control degradation, right? And you emphasized kind of this critical point where many organizations go through and decide what solution they need from a cybersecurity perspective, the problems they're going to solve with, identify it, get it put in place, initial implementation. And then, unfortunately, for many cases, they kind of forget to continuously validate that the control mechanisms are still actually working for them as they intended to, as they actually invested it in initially to do so. So maybe you can kind of provide a little bit of your insights on that way of thinking, if you will, to get us started.
Yeah, I felt like I needed to put a name to this when I finally had that aha moment. Like you look at your career, no matter how long it is, at some point you're like, wow, that just didn't occur to me. And we've been thinking about it incorrectly. So this goes back to, and I even see it out there today. We talk about human error, right? Especially when we talk about IT and the people who are maintaining these systems. It could be even your partners. And so for the longest time, we would actually have that as a category contributing to intrusions. So, what is it? Are we all just, what do we have to do? Have maker checker? Is everybody at fault at some point? And so at somewhere along the way, I realized that it was really not their fault. Because what you see is in high change environments, like a lot of code changes, a lot of build releases, and especially when we switch to agile, 2 week releases, right?
Right.
What happens is the more change, the greater number of changes in these environments, we know that there's a higher chance of mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And those mistakes in the security realm have to do with the loss of a control many times. Control, we'll get into that, but a larger definition of what control is, broader. So, okay, we're blaming people for these mistakes. But wait a second, what if the rate of change that's contributing to this ends up being a function that we can model to see that we should have reduction in confidence of things that we did in the past being effective today based on what's happening in our own environment? And then we come up to, okay, if we realize this, then what do we do about it? And so that got me into, all right, first thing I need to do is recognize that we need to give this a name, and then realize that it's actually a process that we're missing and put the responsibility where it needs to go.
So, let's face it, when you're doing some kind of current state assessment of what your posture is, right? There is a tendency to look at, you may reference some kind of framework and say, okay, these are the kind of controls I need to have in place to be quote unquote secure, right? I've got my perimeter defenses down. I've got identity access management, check, check, check. And so you say, okay, where are the gaps? What don't I have? But you sort of like in your mind might be doing that analysis and saying, I've got those things under control. I already deployed those, last year and the year before. They're good. And so to your point, entropy is happening, right? You have evolution in your environment. There's changes going on, and your tendency of just saying, yep, that's good enough because I've already deployed it. And I'm not looking back. I'm looking forward to what I'm going to do next. And at the same time, the environment has changed, or the fact that the controls may not, the firewall rules you put in place initially when you deployed it may not be reflective of what you need or what has evolved in that rule set today, 3 years later. And so again, how do you then go and validate that what you have is truly protecting you the way you think it is?
Well, let's draw an emphasis going back to how you described that, just so that people get an understanding. We are all burdened with cognitive biases, right? We all have limitations within our brains. Every time you step into an environment that's highly complex, right, you're inheriting the predecessor's work. Could be many, many predecessors, but you're inheriting a bunch of stuff. And then you're spending a lot of time. You might have the team hunting on something that's new, determining that a control needs to be there, a new one. They put it in place. The numbers are staggering when you look at it. So let's just say, use the one example, I think you said firewall. Let's just say you articulate that as two controls. Just try to bucket this.
Yep.
Ingress, egress. Okay, you can place this anywhere, the same model. But let's just take ingress. If the ingress coming from the internet, you may, if you didn't create it from scratch, you may be inheriting 100, 200, 300. I inherited at one point 5,000 ingress rules. I was able to actually do a lot of work and get it down with the team and a lot of validation, get it down to 3,500. Okay, so we have, let's say our frameworks say something like, let's say that there's somewhere like numbers wise 150 controls in CIS, and you choose, critical ones of 75. Under there are huge number of individual actions which the team has invested time to put in place. And this is what you have to understand in all of this. I'm going to be very pointed with this. You can only have confidence, true confidence in what you place in as a control the moment that you put it in, test it.
You're doing that acceptance testing of that control, and that's probably when you're the most rigorous about it, right?
I'm assuming, Stan. Okay, so let's assume that they do that. But at the point where it's a day later, 2 days later, it is possible that somebody puts another control in or makes a change, or there was already a network change happening that rerouted, or there's all kinds of things. And so in that, what happens is you have to realize you have misplaced confidence. If you're doing this job, no one should have confidence in the things that they've done in the past in that environment with intention, unless they went back and checked it.
Now, you could argue probably that the change management processes that you put in place hopefully will raise up some of the,
Hope is not a strategy, Stan.
Hope is not a strategy, and I think people listening would admit that when they write the tests, what they're doing is they're testing the functionality, right? It's like positive use case testing. They're testing that that control they put in place, not that it didn't undermine 500 that they had put in last year.
Right.
That's true. It's very narrow. They're looking at the use case that they're deploying. Right. That is what they're focused on.
It could have negative consequences down the path of whatever you've done in the past.
Yeah, and of course I was burned plenty of times in the past, and people make mistakes on the team, and you can't get upset at them at it, and because it's highly complex. And so, how does everybody as a team agree? Right. Once we realize this, our environment is X dynamic. We do these number of changes per this subsystem, could be cloud, could be network, could be, boundary, this, that, whatever. So you lay all the change out in your environment, and the ones that have the higher rate of the change have the more likely to have an effect on the confidence of the controls in the past. And so what you first need to do is, like, remember the old data inventory? You need to do a data inventory on your controls. You need to be granular with those. And it takes you a while to build that up. So go ahead and identify at least the ones that you put in the last year as being critical. And then look, is there any in there that are foundational that should have been there? When I say a control, let me just also add so that people get this image in their mind. It's not just a firewall rule. If you decide that your DNS logs inside are critical for you identifying, malware, backdoor starting up, whatever, okay, then you've taken that log, you've created a feed into your SIEM, into a data lake. That's a control. And how many times have we had those things go down?
Right. That's a critical source of data to be able to actually enforce that control.
Directly to your answer, you need to get a mapping of all of these in place. And what you need to do is figure out, based on where they're at, just take a guess how often that you should be downgrading your confidence, because there's a slope based on change. I give some guidance in that. And then what you do is you put it into your either your automated offensive testing. Now, here's what you have to do. And yes, you probably couldn't have done this decades ago because we didn't have the tools. But today you've got things like there's lots of tools out there. I hate to just name just a couple that I know, but if they have emulation plans, like testing plans that you can modify, what you want to do is you want to modify those so that they intentionally fail. Right? You're not trying to find holes. You're trying to find or identify that your controls still work. Yeah. So you got to identify which control actually stopped it.
It's really finding that failure points, right?
Which is a positive in this case.
It is. So you know the boundaries in.
Yes, and this is all about. This is why I constantly go back and I harp on things like investment. Trying to get people to understand. Think about the amount of time it took you to put in place. You needed to invest in threat intelligence to get the weaknesses or a heads up or a time to react to something that's being used to attack your industry. You then get it. The team does hunting. Does anything there? Then somebody's doing research on how do I defend against it? And then maybe you have mitigation for a while. And then you decide you can put a control in place or a detection. There was a lot of labor and a lot of time. You have to protect it. So you got to put it into a retest cycle after you get it in.
Yeah. It's like a continuous loop at that point. But I want to dig in deeper to what you were just talking about, because as you're discussing, it's got me thinking. So it's that time of the year where the cybersecurity budgets are starting to roll through. They're in very, very long process, right? And so, as you mentioned, the investment side of it, we can go back and forth about from a cybersecurity kind of reporting structure. Where does the CISO report into? You hear about it going to the CIO, the CTO. They've moved into chief risk officer. At the end of the day, it depends on the specific organization, maybe the vertical, the maturity of the program, what the business logic makes sense to deal with that reporting structure. Put that aside for a second, and let's think about the investments that they're looking at putting in place to better the program. Let's say, Tim, right? I think the approach that you're taking here with the rate of control degradation kind of thought process model, if you almost will, to me, you see a lot of organizations look at and say, okay, we think we have the check boxes of these things completed. So therefore, we're looking at these other areas of interest that could be new shiny objects, unfortunately, in many cases. The reality is, to your point, having that visibility is kind of continuous effort to understand, hey, hold on, there are certain elements of our program, components of our program, and technology factors that we actually are revisiting and seeing, and there's a need to make some sort of change to, maybe replace, what have you, whatever decision comes of that. And that tells me that as much as we're looking at new solutions in certain areas, again, we have to look at our existing capability, and we need to understand what areas we're going to further invest in, because now you have better awareness of where there may be some changes that have caused, again, a need for that to be revisited. So I think you take your model, if you will, it draws great observations to be able to identify where those potential needs are for investments, which then again tie into back time of the year, cybersecurity budget. So just, kind of, does that frame of thinking follow suit in the way you've approached it?
It is, but So first, there's the overall budget question, right? And I've tried to address this because it's the season and there's a lot of different debate. But I'll tell you, I am a firm believer, and first, let me qualify this: is that in 15 years of being a public company, public market CEO, a CISO, I actually have probably reported to a CIO or CTO maybe 5 of those years. The rest of the time, general counsel and across the board. Okay, I wasn't directly in banking, so not the risk officer, but you get my point. I've been all
Right.
Various reporting structures.
yes, and honestly, I don't think it matters. It matters the relationship, the people. Do they understand? Are they an advocate? But you've got to have, regardless of who that reporting structure is, you've got to have FaceTime with your audit committee. You got to have, you know, the people who actually need to know that you're protecting them, the shareholders, the employees, and the customers. They need to hear it from you, and you need to be challenged to explain it to them. Okay, so that being said, I do believe that the budget should be tied to a metric, which is IT. And the reason is because in cyber, if you're a CSO and you have physical, set that aside. But if you're a CISO and you have cyber, then what you're doing is you're trying to address risk associated or potential of misuse, right, of technology. Technology investment by the company is captured in the IT budget. So is the labor that is associated with using that IT. And so what you have is you have this perfect place to actually pin your budget to a certain percentage. And if we're not pinned, and this is the way, a lot of people can debate this, but I think we are 10% of IT as a base, and then we adjust up and down based on the threat landscape and the regulatory landscape of our
And
company.
and again, just others have gone out. Just why this is important is that others have pegged their target cybersecurity budget many times to a completely revenue or a different number outside of IT, right? And that's what you're saying is just like that just doesn't make a lot of sense.
It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense, and it gets us into just these. You'll get into these situations where,
Expectations that are off base.
yeah, somebody had a great analogy. Would you pay more for insurance than you would for your car payment? Car insurance. No, of course not.
No,
Would we ever say that cybersecurity budget should be greater than IT?
no.
No, of course not. We're a percentage, right? And
Right.
so we can debate that percentage, and you don't want to tie it to revenue because obviously that goes down, it fluctuates. You're not getting into the profit margins there, and many businesses are very thin with respect to that. And so, listen, it's captured. The amount of investment in IT technology is in IT. It should be, and that's where you need to align. Okay, now what do you do once it goes down? Now and only now do you have a discussion about consequence. And so your consequences, outage, and you get into the BIA kind of stuff and all of that. But that is just to define within the different areas within when you look at the kill chain, right? First, you got to look at the kill chain. Where are the opportunities to either reduce the probability of this happening or reduce time to discover? And that addresses all of these consequences down at the bottom, right? Now, what we were talking about earlier is all of this. You've taken money, you've added, CapEx and labor, and you've done all of this work, and now you need to protect all of this. So shouldn't we have a process, a life cycle that protects that investment? Absolutely. And that protection, like you said, we could spend money on bright, shiny objects, but that's okay. But we better make sure that we have all the stuff that we've done in the past still effective.
So when you're looking to secure your budget, and again, I guess I view it as you have your base budget, which is running the program, right? That's usually, again, hopefully maintaining what you already have. But then you have your ask for projects for change, right? For additional things. The business case that you have established for that might be a different discussion than trying to ensure that you maintain and hopefully maybe even improve your base. The arguments that you're able to successfully make with 15 years experience in public sector, private sector CISO role, are you able to make that argument align with that kind of impact, kind of indicating that if you reduce my base budget and how I operate, then I'm not going to be able to necessarily protect the organization as effectively, because I can then show you where that is in the kill chain. Or what, do you use that kind of argument, or is it more of a business argument?
Now, listen, it's, it's nuanced, but in essence, you have this. First off, we have fiduciary like responsibility, right? We're not, we don't want to spend too much that's unreasonable. You have to understand your business, that market, so enough to where you can make this argument. Remember, if we spend too much, what we are doing is we're not helping ourselves and we're not helping the
Mm.
company. We're actually proxying the negative consequence of criminals. So you have criminals that are out there, just the presence of them sitting in some country with the fear that they're causing us to take money out of our business, away from our employees' pensions, all of this. And so
And the primary purpose of what you're there for,
it's
flying planes in the context of JetBlue, right?
That's right. That's right. So we've got to this is the art of cyber, right? It's about part investment, it's about spending just what you need. So when you're going to add something, you better be within that realm of what I'm talking about, is what you've already articulated. 10% float, possibly up to 5 if you're in a heavily regulated, or you have human life, or the threat landscape is, there's imminent danger, whatever. You can float a few points, but you've got to be within there. And so this challenges you to figure out, go back into the things that you've invested in and said, what's giving us value? If in some cases, if you have the latitude, listen, we were told to do X, but we know that that's not giving us, the value. You have to be prepared to challenge that and say, listen, our problem, our problem is malware. If you look at the kill chain, the first two is initial compromise within the attack framework, and then execution. If I can get rid of those two, I get rid of a lot of stuff. And so then you start to find pricing, like how much money should I put to this? Then you start establishing what that return on investment, which is reduction in likelihood or time to discover reduction. Those are
So
your two objectives.
this may be an oversimplified example, Tim, but if you have AV and then you are also deployed whitelisting on your endpoints, do you still need the AV? Now you could argue, well, you may not catch everything with that, but again, but that's the kind of thing
Oh
that
my
you may have
gosh,
to look at.
Stan, I love that example, because it didn't occur to me until I just tried it this last go around, that there was actually a way to do true whitelisting. And so that example, like, this is one place that we never actually applied our traditional principles, which is reducing surface area. So
Mm-hmm.
we had this on every endpoint today, every device, unless you're doing what we just mentioned, you are allowing any application to run. If we could shut down those applications to the 50, to the 100, to the 1,000 that are necessary, then the tens of thousands that potentially could run don't. Then you take away drive-bys, you take away people making mistakes, clicking on file attachments, that kind of stuff. And so you're right. It really comes down to, okay, if I can shut down the surface area, then I don't need that signature-based detection, and then I can do some other things.
Yeah, yeah. And I think some of it also, the way you were describing it, kind of comes back into the means of applying a like a risk quantification type of approach to it as well. Because as you said, like if I do these certain things and I can actually tie a value to them, I understand where the biggest impact is for the investment that I'm going to return back to the organization.
I've played around. Don't anybody out there get upset about this. I've tried FAIR. I've tried other things. It doesn't work within the way that my brain works to calculate, and it's
Mm.
not. I came up doing board level troubleshooting on avionics, right? And so you try to break the problem in half, and then you get these little ups and downs, based on where signal's at or voltage or whatever. And so when you think about like how you do this, I work more in the qualitative, but what I do is try to actually find different types of measurement points. So one objective is, I know that I don't have to have a control if I could detect it instantly and react to it instantly.
Mm-hmm.
That's a utopian view. So I know that I can play with these two sides of these. And so if the faster that we can test or detect and shut down, I have to put many less controls in place that potentially can actually shut down the business or break something.
Yeah, makes sense. So Tim, we've covered a lot, right? Can you kind of boil it down to, for the audience, right? Boil it down to the maybe kind of top 3 takeaways that you would suggest to them, as it relates to them getting some good guidance around justifying how to get the right dollar amount for their program and how they're trying to build out or mature their program in many cases.
Yeah, the first one is that, just assume that people are going to make mistakes, and that the environment is too complex for any one person, and it's no one's fault. And just adding 2 people to every change isn't a labor savings at all. What you need to do is you need to actually take some of the tools out there. By the way, sorry, I forgot to mention one thing. If you're not running a purple team, if you don't have a partner, if you don't have your red team and your blue team working together, you're at a disadvantage to what I'm going to say. Okay, so if you are, then what you need to do is you need to empower the red team with tools to do automated testing that they can modify these tests based on your environment. And then what you tell them, I don't want you just to find, like, I'm gonna be so excited if you create tests that fail. Because what we're going to do is we're going to actually figure out what control blocked that, and we're going to give us credit for that. And so it's part of it's a management philosophy, part of it is whatever. So create the purple team, create the process to address the control degradation concept. And that protects your investment. And then on the other side, try to just think about it like this and tell us all if it works, okay? Create just 2 objectives of your organization. One is to reduce the probability, reduce how likely it is for any tactic in the attack framework to occur. If you do that, and then you look down all through there of all of the techniques that they're using, you could actually take out quite a number in that whole execution side or the whole whatever. And then if you can't do something like that, or you think that it might actually take something out of the business, go ahead and try to create an actual event that automatically kicks off as an alert to it. And then you're reducing time to discover, like a tripwire. So break everything that you do, all the tools, the investments, the changes, try to break it into those 2 categories. Some cover both, and then see which ones are most effective and challenge the team, and then test it with testing.
Excellent. And I like that multiplication kind of effect, if you will, right? That's in essence, right? If you find this one thing, you see beneath it that it's going to actually positively impact these other areas of coverage, if you will. Now you're in a greater, shape at this point moving forward. So excellent discussion. Really appreciate you coming on and sharing with us your perspective on this. Thanks again. And I'm sure we'll probably be calling you back for another episode.
All right, sounds good. Thank you for having me.
Thanks again, Tim.
Hello, producer Ben here, and much of the conversation you've just heard focused on cyber budgets. And in the next edition of Reimagining Cyber, Rob and Stan will dig deeper into these matters with the help of Roland Cloutier, former global CISO at TikTok and principal of the Business Protection Group. I can assure you that it is going to be a fantastic episode. You're going to love it. That's out next Wednesday, wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.